Darkness, utter darkness. I felt the sensation in my hands beginning again. I could hear sounds in my ears as if I was undersea. I could feel a trembling sound as if I could hear the very heartbeat of the earth right below in its core. My eyes opened up, and through the dust I saw a fresh burst of light. The whole room, or what was left of it, was shrouded in the brightest of lights. I looked about me and noticed not one cut on my body, just dust. It was as if I had been placed in the building after it had impacted on the ground. I picked myself up, dusted my dirty clothes as best I could, and crawled out of the broken window pane and onto the surface. How long had occurred between the impact and now, I had no idea, but I gauged it must have at least been a day, as the tank which caused the collapse was not inhabited. The thugs had moved on to another place. I turned behind myself to see the building lay across the floor. My eyes filled with tears, and I felt the very hair on my body raise. I felt a strange sensation when one happens to escape something he thought was imminent. The joy when someone is recognized, when love of friends comes his way, all these things and much more. How many million to one it was that I had escaped such a disaster, let alone a building falling so high. I dropped to my knees and began wailing. In the small breeze that carried out the building's dust into my dry and lined face, mouth, and eyes, I felt the searing hot sun burn on my back. It felt as if I had just been reborn. With this newfound energy, I began to run through the city with great speed, charging around as fast as I could, as if I had some point to prove, or maybe after escaping such a thing, I thought myself invincible. I bolted round corners, bends, down roads, pathways through buildings, skidding, sweat flowing in the wind as I sped by, my heart beating in my ears, my breathing fast and furious. I felt like the wind, like the universe, the big bang as it exploded a million miles outwards, like a jet skimming the clouds above. I stopped after I could run no more. My legs ached as if I had run a marathon. I placed my arms on my knees and took deep and erratic breaths. After I had regained my breath, I looked up to see where I was. I was standing outside a disused tube station. I went inside. The name read Elephant and Castle. I jumped over the barrier and onto the platform. 2 lines were empty, one at a train with its doors wide open. I walked inside and walked from one end to another. On the floor lay a familiar sight, a tramp sprawled out. I pulled up his lifeless body and placed him on the chair. It was hard to know whether he was alive or dead, but the smell reassured if doubt I had. I left this train and entered the tunnel by foot. I walked a few yards and then came back up the back of another train that seemed to have halted there. I opened the emergency exit and walked into the lit train. I walked through 3 carriages, and then I found a full carriage full of dead bodies, propped up against the seats, bags in their hands, cups, plates of food, newspapers out of date. I covered my nose and walked through the crowded carriage. As I got to the front end of the train, it got worse, as the people had obviously been standing up due to the lack of space, were piled up upon one another on the floor. One was even hanging by a pull cord. I got to the front. I decided I would try pulling the lever to start the train, and to my surprise it worked, and the train joggled down the line. I passed one station then another, until I found myself out in the open. I pulled the lever down and climbed out the door to the grassy embankment that beckoned. I walked down the track till I found myself at another station. I walked through the ticket office to the town outside. By this time my legs were aching. I knew I couldn't walk all the way to my parents' house. I had to get some means of transport. I didn't have to go too far till I found another bus, this time a big red double-decker. I got inside, pulled the dead driver out of his seat and threw him on the pavement along with the 3 passengers, started the engine and was off. A day on the road, maybe 2, passed. It was about 8 in the evening when I pulled up in front of my house. It was a familiar place. I had spent most of my childhood there, and it looked the same as I had once left it. The street lamps were out. I broke the door open with my shoulder. I walked into the living room calling out for Mum and Dad, but got no answer. I switched the light on. It didn't work. I found a candle unlit in the kitchen drawer and lit it with some matches I also found there. Mum and Dad were always prepared for all sorts of eventuality. I looked back in the living room. There on the shelves were pictures from a time way gone, of me as a kid, my mum and dad, kicking a ball in some park. Next to it was a clock that still carried time, a piece of paper with my mum's handwriting on it, a shopping list, an ornament my dad had brought for their anniversary, well polished and looked after, next to a picture of them with beaming smiles. I walked up the carpeted stairs with the light shining a little distant in front of me. I opened my bedroom door. It was just the same as I had left it, along with the green toy puppet I had played with as a kid. Then I walked across the corridor to my mum and dad's bedroom. I pushed the door ajar and peered into it. The light of the candle wasn't sufficient to tell me, at that distance, whether they were alive or dead. There was no movement, no acknowledgement of my entrance, but I had to walk up close to be sure. As I got closer, I could see my mum's eyes flickering from one side to the other. I jumped on the bed to hug her. As I did, I felt the coldness of my dad. It was the unmistakable cold of death. I looked at my father's face one more time, his eyes staring straight up at the ceiling. In them I saw a certain kind of sadness. His hands were clasped together. I felt in my mind whether maybe he had hoped to have seen me before he had given up his last breath, and maybe that disappointment, as hard as it was for me to acknowledge, was the fact that I had made it too late. I started to cry uncontrollably as the man I had so much admired, the man who'd given me love like no other, who brought me into this world, was no more. My mother began to cough in a painful way. I pulled myself closer to her. I started to speak to her, even though it probably didn't make much sense. I knew not what to say, but I could tell from the lack of her reaction that she could not understand. Her pupils flickered constantly from side to side. Fluid dribbled from her mouth to a wet patch on her shirt. She mumbled a few words, but they were inaudible. I could not make out what she said. Oh God, I thought, now I'd wished that she too was dead like my father, for I could see she was in pain and was no longer the mother I knew. I desperately wanted her to speak to me words of love as my mother had, wanted her to just look into my eyes as she had when I was a kid, that beautiful gaze of motherly love, comfort and protection. It was all gone. Now our eyes showed only pain and a sense of abandonment. She mumbled something again, but I could not understand. The tears in my eyes ran down my cheeks to see this unfortunate scene, to witness the demise of your loved ones. I knew one day this would come, as all men have to taste of death. But oh God, what a suffering it is to watch those that you love wither away, those that brought you with love into life, to die alone and in pain. I sat by her holding her hand, not knowing if she truly knew I was there by her, as she coughed out some red blood and began to choke. Her eyes stopped darting for a moment and focused squarely on my face, and for a second I thought her mouth curled up to make a smile, and then the life was sucked out of her, and with that last exhale, she was no more. I sat by the foot of my parents' bed for an age, just sobbing into my hands, whilst my mind like a movie played back all those scenes of childhood, of the good times, the bad times, making me laugh and guilty at the same time. I left that room, switched off the light, and sat on my old bed, and stared out as I did when I was younger the window into the night sky, until my eyes could take it no more, and a sweeter slumber did I fall.